much. Okay, so you know what my name is, and the other thing you should know, yeah, the title of the talk is Prosopography and Computer Ontologies towards a formal representation of the factoid model by means of CIDOC CRM. This is work I carried out together with John Bradley, and both of us belong to King's College in London, in the UK. Okay, so the talk focuses on the discipline of digital prosopography, and in particular on one specific approach to digital prosopography that John Bradley and other colleagues at King's College have been developing in the years, called factoid-based prosopography. So I'm going to describe in a few words what we mean by factoid-based prosopography, what is the conceptual model behind this approach, and how it's become a key tool for constructing prosopographical databases. So, however, as you're probably very aware of, nowadays it's not a good idea to work in isolation, especially when building a database. Web technology allows us to connect to other possibly related resources so easily that it has become imperative when designing a new digital resource to think in advance about the issues of semantic interoperability. That is, being able to integrate our data with others and letting our users access our data in a programmatic fashion. So, one of the enabling technologies in this case are formal ontologies. So in the last part of the talk, I'll describe our recent efforts to move our factoid-based approach towards a more ontology-compliant format, and specifically how we did that, extending a well-known standard for cultural heritage data, CIDOC CRM. So, prosopography is a branch of historical research that traditionally has focused on the identification of people that appear in historical sources. Pre-digital prosopographies, such as Martindale's prosopography of the later Roman Empire, presented its materials as narrative articles about the individuals it contains. The figure shows a typical brief article for someone identified as Eucharius IV. In this article, Martindale tells us a story about this person, mostly based on information he found on the Sidonius Apollinaris Epistulae, that is, the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris. Even within the rather terse style of this rather brief article, one can see the complexity and subtlety of narrative playing a role. However, a closer look at these articles reveals a rather formal, structured text with a carefully defined kind of interests, dates and dating, of course, and information about in which text the person appeared, but also titles or offices the person held, places with which he is associated, other people with whom he had connections, and so on. So, objects of interest begin to emerge from the text that can provide a basis for a structure to manage them. Since the early 90s, at King's College, we've been developing prosopographies, prosopographical databases, which focus, for example, on the Byzantine World, on Anglo-Saxon England, medieval Scotland, and now more generally Northern Britain. Indeed, across the diverse range of structured prosopographies that we have worked on, a certain set of core interests, and therefore structural elements always appear. Titles people held, or relationships between individuals are seemingly always relevant, for example. Other types of structural elements are instead more specific to certain contexts, such as transactions or possessions, which are usually found only in projects that deal with charters. Overall, then, our experience has led us to believe that certain elements of structure represent key interests in the mind of many prosopographers as they carry out their work. Furthermore, this formal structuring allows us not only to look up a particular person, but to use the database to approach the data in a whole range of different perspectives. But it hasn't been always easy to sell the structured prosopography approach to our project partners, to the historians. Narratives are a powerful mechanism to represent historical research. For example, due to their ability to be multidimensional, complex, and non-linear. So downplaying or eliminating narratives about people is often causing historians to worry, and rightly so, especially if we take the wrong approach of using the database as the surrogate of the original document. And it is precisely in this context that the notion of factoid was first developed. Oddly enough, the word factoid was coined by Norman Mailer in his 1973 biography of Marilyn Monroe. Mailer described factoid as facts which had no existence before appearing in a magazine or newspaper. So in a similar fashion, in our prosopographical model, the factoid represents a spot in a primary source where something is said about one or more persons. It links people to the information about them via spots in primary sources that assert that information. You probably have noticed the ironic flavor of the name factoid. This is intentional and reflects a concern that historians often have towards the veracity of the sources, since the action of taking materials out of context has to be done with care. So, by creating factoids which assert things about what the source says about people, the factoid approach prioritizes the sources rather than our historians reading them. Our data about a person is not then so much a narrative that presents a summary written by the prosopographer as a collection of information about what the sources say about him or her, and can represent the multiple, perhaps contradictory, voices of the different sources simultaneously. One saying this person is a Saxon, and another one saying that this person was from Northumbria, for example. Perhaps the source is thought to be a forgery or a statement that arises out of what we now consider prejudice. Factoids, however, represent what a particular source says on its own, rather than what we now believe arising out of our reading of a range of sources. If two sources contradict each other, two contradictory factoids will be recorded. For this reason, we call the factoid model source-driven. In this figure, we can see a simplified approach of a data structure diagram that exemplifies this approach. You can see how the bit of text from the story, which is the subject of this factoid, describes an event that connects together individual people and places. But these entities are not attached directly to the source object at the bottom, thus maintaining a separation between sources and the assertions we identify in them. This is instead a screenshot of the user interface of one of our recent prosopographical databases called the Paradox of Medieval Scotland. And this page shows all the information available for a person named Adam of Eccles. You can see highlighted on the right the different types of factoids associated to this person, and for each of them the sources they have been derived from. Here are some statistics that give you an idea of the incredible amount of work historians put into this project. And to some extent, this reinforces our assumption that the model we've been using, the factoid model, suits the data collection activity. However, it is important to point out that models do not exist in isolation, but rather, as McCarthy reminds us, they exist within a specific context, and for that reason they always have a purpose, be that explaining a phenomenon or designing an artifact. So in the case of the typical prosopographical projects we've been dealing with, we can identify four main areas where models have some role. In the data acquisition phase, models need to reflect express workflow and conceptualization of the domain. In the data storage area, models must comply with principles of efficiency and costs. In the information architecture or visualization phase, models should facilitate finding information and making sense of it in a way that reflects the discipline's discourse. Finally, there are models that are more suited in the context of data integration scenarios. For example, because they are more easily shared and understood by the interested parties. So what do we mean by data integration and semantic interoperability? Essentially, it's the ability of merging data coming from different digital sources in a meaningful and useful manner. For example, we can think of a scenario where two of our recent prosopographies, PoMS and Bob, deal with, two of these prosopographies both happen to deal with people who lived around the border between Scotland and England. In this scenario, we can easily have persons, such as Adam of Eccles, that have their own record in both databases. Ideally, we would like to be able to connect these two records and the associated factoids, or at least provide users with a point of access that knows how to make sense of this information. And it is precisely this aspect that we needed to investigate further. In fact, the factoid model has been used successfully, sometimes in minor revisions, obviously, in all the other areas but the data integration one. This is due to the fact that the model of factoid we developed is too arbitrary and application specific, to the effect that within a real data integration scenario, the factoid notion quickly becomes an obstacle for who wants to access and make use of our prosopographical data. Essentially because understanding the notion of factoid requires quite a bit of background knowledge. So let me clarify this problem with another example. This example doesn't focus on factoids directly, but on the representation of persons, which as we've seen are normally linked to factoids. So in this case, we have two databases containing information about the same person, Adam of Eccles, but each database represents the notion of persons using a different and partially overlapping structure. The first one has a name and surname fields, while the second one has a name and place name fields. So the issue then is, how can we integrate this type of information using a tolerant approach? That is, in a way that doesn't enforce one model to collapse into the other one, or any information to be lost. So one possible solution is to use a model which is more abstract, and which separates the identity of persons from their names through an entity called appellation. So the appellation entity can thus be extended so to include both databases representations of names. This is not just a possible solution, but also an elegant one, for it doesn't rule out any interpretation of the person in question, but rather it includes them into a more comprehensive model. So as a result, the model that integrates the two different data sources provides us with a more abstract and application-independent perspective on the meaning of the data. Also, we can say that this perspective embeds an ontological view of the world, a view which aims at being, as far as possible, close to the things in themselves, so to say, rather than being dependent on specific application scenarios. So now, provided we could express this model using a formal language, what we see here could become part of a computational ontology. In general, the principles of computational ontologies provide us with a theory of how to make categorical distinctions in a systematic and coherent manner, to the purpose of creating models that are capable of acting like semantic glue, among other more application-specific models. Just like the model we've just seen in the context of persons and names. And indeed, that model, the one that separates persons from names, is taken from a well-known ontology called the CIDOC CRM. The ontology was initially built in 1996 as a means of maintaining interoperability among museum data, but has been found later to be of interest to historical projects more generally. The model has improved a lot since 1996, to becoming in 2006 an ISO standard. It includes concepts and relations describing people, organizations, places, events, physical objects, and conceptual ones. In particular, one of the most interesting features of CIDOC is its event-centered design. What this means is that temporal entities have a central role in this approach, as we can see in this abstracted diagram. Although we have, although we have different types of entities, such as actors, conceptual objects, and places, they're kind of all put together through the temporal entities in the middle. So CIDOC, in some sense, it forces you to define all the marginal entities through temporal entities. So moving back to our factoid-based prosopographies, if you want our data to be more interoperable, it would be desirable to express their meaning using a language which uses less arbitrary notions than the one of factoids. In other words, how can we model the factoid notion using a more ontologically sound approach? What do we mean really when we talk about factoids? The solution to this problem can be found by reducing the factoid notion to other notions which are more primitive. We realize that each time we introduce a factoid, we imply the existence of at least three entities: a person who creates the factoid, a document that contains the factoid, and a state of affairs, which is what the factoid is about. So with reference to the example I presented at the beginning, the person would be Martindale, the document is the epistolate he was looking at, and the state of affairs is the fact that Eucherius IV was an illustrious, was defined as an illustrious person. So, at a further analysis, we realize that in most cases, the state of affairs described by this document is either a situation or an event, which means more generally a temporal entity, something that happened at a specific place and a specific time. So now this gives us a quite complete picture, if not for the fact that the three entities are not really related to each other. So we need to represent also the implicit act of associating them together into a meaningful unit. So we achieve this by introducing the concept of interpretation, which can be defined as another temporal entity with a specific structure. It has an author, a subject, and an object. At this stage, we obtain a quite detailed generic representation of factoids. We could be used, for example, in order to export the data in our databases and make it available to other people, for example, in a semantic web context. However, in order to enhance the semantic interoperability of our model, we decided to try to express it using the formalisms offered by the CIDOC CRM ontology. In particular, there is a concept in CIDOC CRM called attribute assignment that seems to be quite suitable to our meaning of interpretation in our scenario. An attribute assignment is a temporal entity, that's something that happened at a particular time in a particular place, and its stated purpose is to represent actions of people making propositions and statements during certain museum procedures. For example, the person and date when a condition statement was made, an identifier was assigned, or the museum object was measured. It is evident that the attribute assignment concept was created so to be used in a museum context, consistently with the stated purpose of the CIDOC CRM model. But its structure matches quite well our interpretation concept as well, so we thought it would be interesting to subclass the attribute assignment with the new concept we created. And this is the resulting model. So in the resulting model, our factoids will be transformed into document interpretation acts, which are activities which are carried out by a person and assign state of affairs to documents. That is to say, they say that a document is about a certain state of affairs. This model seems to work quite fine, although it also raised 3 issues which I'm only going to describe quickly, as we haven't finalized our solutions for them as yet. So first, the factoid approach. In the factoid approach, the relationship between a source and the assertions made in that source was implicitly meant to be as literal as possible. In other words, the historian should avoid doing an interpretive work, just pass on the contents of the source into a digital format, thus making it available in its purity, so to say, to the database users. We felt that this meaning isn't expressed very well by the assigned relation. Because in theory, any type of interpretation can be assigned to a document, not just the one that wants to reflect the source literally. So maybe we should be trying to narrow down the semantics of the relation, maybe by using something like it's about event or claims that or asserts, which would become sub-properties of the assigned property. Moreover, by taking our last consideration further, we realize that notion of interpretation, intended as the institution of a connection between 2 entities, doesn't seem attached to any connection in particular. So it becomes plausible to have a range of possible relations that we can use for characterizing the way we create these connections. We could organize these relations within a continuum according to their strength, for example, so we might decide to have 3 possible evidence relations according to the degree of certainty historians may have. But this reflection opens up a path towards modal logic, for it allows to create claims such as document X may be about situation Y. I'm quite sure historians could make use of this type of claims. The question is then how to treat them within the database when searching for things, or performing inferences based on the existing data. It goes without saying that this opens up a whole range of new issues when building digital prosopographies. Finally, this line of thinking can be even taken further to the point that we might as well want to introduce negatives in the picture. For example, by letting people say that according to document X, event E never happened. Obviously here we're abandoning the strictly source-based approach of factoids, since these are all inferences based on background knowledge. But the speculation is inevitable as long as we decide to move towards an ontological model of interpretations. So, wrapping up, essentially during my talk I touched on 3 fundamental points. First, I've shown you that the factoid-based approach in structural prosopography is a successful one. Second, I've talked about how it can be ontologized, in particular by making use of CIDOC CRM. Third, I've shown you the remaining open issues that derive from a careful ontological consideration of the notion of interpretation. Currently, we're working on a more precise formalization of these ideas to the purpose of using it to make available our most recent prosopographies as linked data. Well, as open data that can be accessed by anybody. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much. Questions, comments? Please.
I wonder, this actually is a problem outside the scope of just prosopography. I think anybody who's dealing with linked data or doing projects with linked data, after they've done few projects like this starts to realize that anytime you're pulling data from different sources, you want to start treating it as whatever your assertions are. You also want to be able to connect it to particular sources and information about those sources. I think in a way you guys are ahead of the curve in terms of you're dealing with problems that everybody's going to be dealing with, whether they're using whether prosopography is their domain or not. And some people have suggested that these kind of things actually need, rather than being particular aspects of particular ontologies, but need to be built in at a lower level. So we need, rather than dealing with triples, we need quintuples or whatever to add in like information about sources and who's making the link between a particular source and a particular assertion. So I guess this hasn't really turned into a question, but I think you're on the right path, and it would be interesting to sort of keep your eyes open for these discussions going on in bordering communities and make sure people are aware of your work and the other related kind of constructs that people are coming up with that you could be using as well, maybe.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how to answer that. Yes. One thing I didn't really say, but I thought it was implied by the things I didn't say, is the fact that I'm not sticking to any particular technology here. I didn't mention the words, RDF, OWL, and all of that stuff, which obviously what comes by default with this type of ontology-based approaches. But in theory, you could use other technologies. I mean, you're not really forced to use what is put forward by the W3C. So in my view, I mean, the key issues here are all at the semantic level. I mean, they reflect the fact that we should try to stick to we should represent things in a way which is more abstract and more application independent, rather than focusing all the time on the specific purposes of our project. Then I didn't quite catch your comment about quadruples and quintuples.
Well, I think just people are realizing the limit. Like you said, you're not tying yourself to particular technologies, and I think people are often run into the limitations of technologies like RDF, or they start saying they want to extend RDF and things like that, and because they're running into the same kinds of issues that you're already dealing with. And
other comments, questions?
Thank you very much. Very interesting. And like the previous questioner, I am reminded of work I've encountered elsewhere that essentially says, we don't want to say that X is Y. We want to say that he said on this date that X is Y. And in fact, we want to say that I said on this date that he said on that date that X is Y. So good work there. In that same connection, the work I'm thinking of, Fabio Vitali and others in Bologna, have come to the conclusion that they need to distinguish carefully between documents that report on state of affairs, that is, documents whose speech act is declaration, is expository, the making of factual claims, from documents which do not make factual claims, but which do things, like legal codes. If an author says the term of copyright is life of the author plus 50 years, the author may be right or wrong. If a law says the term of copyright is a certain term, the law is not right or wrong. The law makes it so. And I'm wondering if, A, if you have consciously encountered that problem, and B, whether you have or not, whether the notion of parameterizing the relation with the relation kind is evidence for asserts and so forth, would be a help in making that
Yeah.
distinction?
Yeah, I think it would. I think catering for this type of situations, I think it requires some sort of model approach to determination of the truth of the assertions you make. Up to now, I mean, the funny thing is that, I mean, when we created Prosopographies, this is very fancy. I mean, the practical problem we have at the moment is that we have all of these structural prosopographies and we want to open them up, yeah, and possibly link them together. Okay, but in terms of the type of information we try to structure, people ran into this type of problems, but somehow it never emerged as an issue because the fact that, I mean, the kind of source-based approach, the fact that you need to stick to what the source says, somehow it just rules out the problem. So we're not really solving the problem. We're just saying it's not a problem for us yet.
Okay.
Exactly. So that's what's going on. Because in theory, even if you have a legal document, it could be a forgery.
Well, it
So
can
what
be
do you do in that case?
Or I could be misunderstanding it. So hence their
Yes.
emphasis on saying, no, you do not say that this law establishes this fact. You say, on this date, I claimed that this law established that fact.
Yes.
So that you reify the active RDF. Yes, they are using RDF. They would like to use RDF, only they need octuples instead of triples. And they want to reify the act of formulating the formal description.
Well, we're doing that already by using factoids.
Yeah.
But I think what you're trying, what I understood you were trying to point out is certain types of documents. They kind of imply some, a higher degree of truth.
Or there's something different.
Yeah.
And the philosophers are still arguing about what.
Okay. Well, I guess from the point of view of historians, they're probably more interested, and this is what my assumption, I'm not a historian, but they're probably more interested in just reporting the source independently of whether it's a source of type X or Y. At least when building digital projects. So, thanks.